As any farmer or antique car enthusiast will tell you, there gets to be a point in your machine's life where it reaches an age that to get parts for it, it makes more sense just to find complete other units and pull parts off of them. Sometimes parts are no longer supported by the manufacturer or third party, and it just makes sense to have extra machines. That's kind of the case with the Green Machine. Either that or it's multiplying. When I first started this project, there were a couple of pieces that were missing that I just couldn't get from RCBS since they don't make the parts anymore. So kind of started the search for parts machines, and now I have a couple. Like that. Or like that. And even that one. And the best part is, sooner or later, all the same pieces are broken on all of them. So you're back to square one again, but you have more junk. So hopefully you've watched part one of the Green Machine series of videos where we went over the basic operation and kind of how the Green Machine works when it does work. It's the previous video, and if you haven't, you need to go do that right now. And don't worry, I'll wait. Have you watched it yet? Okay, we're going to assume you did watch it. So in the first video, we went over how this works, and you'll notice that I kind of had some hiccups while I was operating the machine, and mentioned that this has kind of a notoriety for having its quirks and not being super reliable, and a lot of people were kind of disgusted with it. And so I promised that second part of the video we'd go over kind of the intricacies of it and why this turned out to be not such a very popular press and a little bit of a flop for RCBS. So that's what we're going to do right here. I have setting out here for kind of comparison purposes a Dillon. This is a RL 450, and it's not because I think Dillons are just the best presses in the world or have any affiliation with them. I mean, I've got a couple of them and I think they're fantastic products, but it just so happens that I have a press from a competitor, does pretty much the exact same thing, was released about the same time frame, and so marketed toward similar people. And most people, when they're looking at an investment like this, they do some comparison shopping. So I thought I would have a comparison for the Green Machine and show some things that were a little bit of a failure or a little bit of a quirk on the Green Machine, and how they were addressed in a manner that was simple to use and maybe worked a little bit better. And so maybe we'll conclude on why this was a little bit of a flop. So we're going to get going right now. So the Green Machine hit the market in the early 80s. I think it was 81 through 85. And about that same time, the 450, the Dillon 450, also came on the market. There was a predecessor to it, the RL 300, that was a little bit earlier. But this was about the same time as the Green Machine. The Dillon 550, so essentially the same press, but a few updates like a removable tool head, an automatic powder measure, and automatic priming system, but the geometry is more or less the same. The 550 came out in 85, so right at the tail end of the Green Machine run. So it's kind of neat to look at the two in comparison. One of the interesting things is if you look back and you're able to find an ad that for the Green Machine, the list price on this thing was somewhere around $500 in the early 80s. And if you compare that to the other progressive reloading presses at the time, or extrapolate it out to $20, that was a lot of money then. I think, according to my little Google Box inflation calculator thing, $500 in 1981 is equivalent to about $1,400 now, which will buy you a couple of brand new Dillon 550s, even a couple of the 750s now, so it was not a cheap press at the time. One other interesting thing, just kind of as a background information here, is I have the owner's manuals for both the Green Machine and the RL 450. One thing to note right away is that the 450 owner's manual, which includes general operation, everything you need to know about it, schematics, photographs, even conversions and parts list and all that, everything you want in an owner's manual, this is in total 10 pages long. If I look at the Green Machine manual, which has all the same info in it, I mean, pictures, how to operate it, parts list, parts schematics, this bad boy is 40 pages long. That's not even including the 10-page troubleshooting supplement and alternative parts numbers for different caliber conversions. That tells you something right away about kind of the complexity of operating these two machines. I'm going to read something off of this for the Dillon 450 here real quick. Right at the top, the reloading machine for shooters who hate to reload. So right away implying that this machine, simple to operate, people that don't necessarily like fiddling with reloading machines, this is marketed toward them, right? For somebody that doesn't really care about the reloading process, easy to operate, this is for you. Of course, people that do like the machines, it's even for them. Read something off of the very first page of the Green Machine manual. Actually, it's the third page. Introduction. The Green Machine is different. Mechanical ability and extensive reloading knowledge are not sufficient to justify reloading with the Green Machine before reading this manual and becoming thoroughly familiar with its contents. Premature operation will very likely result in unnecessary expense for part damage and expose the operator to certain safety hazard. Yikes. This isn't for your entry-level reloader. This is not a simple machine, and I think you saw that in part one, right? There's a lot going on here. So right away, we have something that's marketed as being very simple to operate. This, right up front, there's a warning that there's a high degree of likelihood you're going to get frustrated with this thing. So that tells you something right there. So I have this 450. It has the 38 special conversion in it, just like this one's set up for 38 special. And you'll note that this is also 4 stations. The Green Machine is 4 stations, more or less the same arrangement. So in station 1 you'd have your decap and your resize. The Dillon primes in station 1, the Green Machine actually primes in station 2. Powder dump, station 2, same with the Green Machine. 3 would be your bullet seat, same with here, 3. And 4 is going to be your crimp station, same here, crimp. I don't have dies up here, but it doesn't really matter for the purpose of this. I will note that the Dillon, this 450 is set up for a manual powder drop, so each case that would go into station 2 you have to manually actuate the powder dump, and then the same for the primer feed. So each one that you would want to prime, you have to operate the primer slide to pull a primer from the magazine. Those features are automated on the Green Machine, but other than that, it's a pretty fair comparison here. I mentioned on the last video that the intent was, from what I can tell, on the Green Machine is to offer a base machine with several different caliber conversions, and you could swap it to different calibers, and it turned out that that wasn't such a smooth process, and so really they were dedicated to one singular caliber. On the 450, this is explicitly made to be very easily swapped between calibers. You could do virtually every pistol or rifle cartridge that you would ever encounter on a 450. The exclusions being some of the super big magnums and like the 50 BMG. It's not going to work on the 450, but neither on the Green Machine. A conversion for this takes me about 5 minutes or so. You swap the shell plate, the locator buttons. If you need to change primer size, you change the primer cup, adjust the powder measure, and switch out your dyes. So it's a very quick process. Again, not easily swapped on the Green Machine. Notice that on the Green Machine we do have 2 standard dyes. The decapping and resizing die and the crimp die are just your regular run-of-the-mill dies, nothing special there. There are 2 sets of dies, however, that are exclusive to the Green Machine. That's the powder and the flare die here, and then the bullet seating arrangement, this whole mechanism and die here. So those 2 would have to be purposely bought for the Green Machine. On the 450, 3 dies, your size, decap, seating, crimping, those are your 3 standard dies. You can use anything you want. The powder dump has obviously a powder die here, and then each caliber would need its own powder funnel and flare die inside there. But other than that, you're buying regular dies, right? You're not out the expense for a special machine-specific die. So that's kind of the story on the dies there. One other thing, while we're up on the top of the machine here, the Green Machine uses what's called the Little Dandy powder measure system from RCBS, and actually it doesn't work too bad as a standalone powder dump. You have a powder cylinder here that's pre-measured for a certain volume of powder, and you look at your caliber chart or your conversion chart and say, okay, this number of rotor throws this charge weight of all these different powders. So that's what you decide to put on here. It does have the little pin system in the back of here to activate it. But if you want to change powders, you want to change charge weights, if you're experimenting, you have to buy a new rotor every time you want to change something about your powder throw. On the 450, it comes with 2 powder bars, basically a large and a small, and they have a range that they can accommodate. Most pistol calibers use the small bar, most rifle cartridges use the large bar. So once you have those 2 bars, you can adjust whatever charge weight you have simply by adjusting this nut on the back here. It's actually a screw that goes through and opens and closes the powder measure bar inside there. So once you have those 2, you're set for virtually everything. There is actually a magnum size bar for the really big rifle calibers, but those are fairly uncommon. So powder measure, changing, this is obviously much simpler, much cheaper to do. You only have to have 2 parts, everything else can be adjusted. One of the frustrations with this system is you have to manually tell the powder measure when to not throw a charge or set it to throw a charge. And if you're not paying attention, you can dump a charge of powder out onto your empty case bar down here and create a huge mess. So you have to turn it off or on. Once it's on, it's going to stay on until you pull the pins on and turn it off. The 450, it's manually activated, so even if you don't have if you have no cartridge in here and I cycle the handle, it's not going to dump. I have to manually drop a charge like that. On the newer 550s, those are case activated powder systems, so if you don't have a case in station number 2, it's not going to throw any powder. So you avoid that problem of dumping a bunch of powder out onto your empty shell plate and creating a huge mess. That's one of the big problems with the Green Machine is sometimes you get some powder leakage down in all these small parts down in the case transfer bar, and now your primer stem hangs up, or it gets underneath the little tiny springs and the case transfer pawls, and those don't work, and now you have a big mess. So powder system, a little bit complicated, and you really have to be on top of your game on it with the Green Machine. One of the next quirks about the Green Machine, and something you'll see discarded on most of the machines that are still operational, is the primer feed system. And how this works is you have a tray that you dump all your primers into, as long as they're oriented the correct way. And then each time you cycle the handle, this spring, little spring lever here, advances this wheel and picks up a primer from the tray, drops it through this stem into the primer transfer bar down here, and then that cycles it under the case bar, and then the punch, when you cycle the handle all the way up, the punch comes up and seats the primer in there. These I have never gotten to work for more than half a dozen rounds or so. These are, in my opinion, complete junk, this primer feed mechanism. I don't know how to get it to work right. One of the big complaints on it, besides that it has just a huge number of moving pieces and bunches of springs, is that every time you cycle the handle, it tries to turn the wheel and feed a primer unless you manually disengage it by moving that spring. So say you have a jam in there or something you want to cycle your cartridges through, you have to remember to make sure to disengage the primer feed, otherwise it's trying to feed another primer on top of the one that's already in there, because it cycles every time you move the handle up and down. So just like the powder measure, you have to be conscious of what you're actually doing and disengage that when you don't want a primer to feed. On the 450, like we mentioned, this is set up manually. So, making our comparison here, we have to manually make the effort each time to pick up a primer and then drop it on here. So there's no danger of trying to double feed primers on this. When you look at the 550s, it does cycle the primer system each time, but the way it's set up, it will not double feed a primer into your primer cup. There's nothing to disengage. It's pretty foolproof. It does take just a little bit of finagling to get all the primer cups and the stops all aligned on here, but again, I can do that in 30 seconds or so on the 450s and 550s. Green Machine, anybody's guess. I can't get it to work. I know that there are a few people that have just pitched this system and made an adapter where they could use a primer tube, so similar to the 450 here, use a tube that then gravity feeds the primers down into the primer feed mechanism, somehow like that. But one of the problems there is that runs into the powder measure. I can't just stick this in here because it hits this knob, so you have to either have it bent one way or the other, or use a different powder feed system, which some folks have converted the powder feed over to like a Lee system. And I suppose that works, but as far as buying a machine ready to go, it's pretty finicky. So I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but the overall complexity of the Green Machine is really something that has turned a lot of people away from it. I find it fascinating because I love machines, but there's a lot going on here. If I look at the complete parts list in the owner's manual and count up the individual pieces on here, there's something like 180 part numbers listed for the Green Machine, and that's set up in just one caliber here. If I look at the 450 parts list, there's 70 individual pieces listed for a complete 450, and that is also set up in one caliber. So roughly 3 times as many pieces in the Green Machine as in the 450. I think that really frustrated a lot of people. There's a lot going on here, and if we look at some of the real critical parts, like the case transfer pieces and the springs for the primer system, they are little bitty tiny. I mean, there's springs in here that rival pieces in your AR-15 blower. Just some little tiny pieces and pins in here. So once you get those gummed up with powder or crud from your brass, it's difficult. I'm actually fortunate I have some of these factory spare parts kits that I was able to manage to snag as part of the deal with some of these extra machines, and so I'm pretty well set for spare parts on this machine. If you contact RCBS about it, they're gonna say, sorry, tough luck. They can get you pieces for the little dandy powder measure, and they can get you the dies, And as far as I know, that is it. If you're unfortunate enough to break any of the little case transfer parts or any of the parts in the seating die with the stem, you're essentially done with that machine. There's no coming back from it. You're looking at buying extra parts or extra machines just for the parts. And unfortunately, a lot of those machines have the exact same small pieces broken on them. The 450, this shares a lot of the same pieces with the 550 that's currently being manufactured. In fact, Dillon will even convert this over to a 550 if you want to. I have no desire in doing that. This is actually a super early 450. Has some brass pieces on it that are kind of a carryover from the earlier 300. So this is staying the same. But if I go over to my 550 and I unbolt the powder measure and I unbolt the primer feed mechanism, I take the shell plates off, all that will go right on here. So there's actually still support from the factory for this because they've carried over the commonality of those parts, and it's a really good setup. So again, I'm not just raving about Dillon, but the fact that this press is the same age as this press, I can go to virtually any big box sporting goods store and buy caliber conversions, individual pieces, and they'll drop right on this. That's a big plus. Whereas this, you're in for a hurt. So on the subject of caliber conversions, if you do end up with a couple of these Green Machines, you actually can change the caliber up on them with a few limitations. They were originally offered in 9mm 38/357, 45 ACP, and 44 mag, 44 special. And so if you find a machine that has those different parts on it, in theory you can swap some of them over, but there's something you have to watch out for. Two things that I'm aware of. That's discounting, of course, that you just know right off the bat that the primer feed mechanism's basically never going to work and you'll have to prime off the press or come with something else. The first being that this bullet seating die here is caliber specific. Remember, we drop our bullet through here and it holds it in there until you cam the press down and it seats the bullet into the case. You have to have one of these for each caliber. Downside to that is they're no longer made. This is one of the commonly broke pieces on here. So if you don't have that die, you're out of luck. You can replace this with just a standard die, but now you're seating the bullet by your fingers down inside of here, and that's a good way to mash your fingers, and it's not real handy. The other thing is you have to look at the case feed mechanism on here. And so this one's set up in 38 special, and there's a hole in here that the cases would drop through the feed tubes down into, and then there's a slot. So my 38 special, yeah, fits right in there, right? Cool, good to go. If I had ambitions to convert this over to 45 ACP or 44 mag, I'm in trouble again because those don't fit in there. In theory, you could, if you had one for the larger calibers, you fit the smaller, if you had a 44 mag press, the 38 special would drop in there, but now the cutout at the bottom is a different size and you're a little bit loosey-goosey flopping around in there. I actually have a press in 44 mag and I've tried it in there, and when I try to transfer the cartridge along the bar, even with the correct bars and guides in there, it misfeeds a lot of time because that opening in the base of there is too big and it gets all wonky. So something to be aware of if you have ambitions to try to convert one of these over. So, in the big picture, what's the final conclusion here? Why is this kind of a flop for RCBS when there are obviously other progressives? The CH, that one was around for a long time and it has a pretty good following still. There's other linear progressives that did all right. And again, I don't know for sure. RCBS doesn't really want to talk about it too terribly much, but I think it came down to two things, and that's from the perspective of a consumer, right? One, this thing was expensive. If I drop the equivalent of $1,400, $20 on a machine today, I would want it to be pretty flawless. I wouldn't want to have to tinker with it a whole lot, and I definitely wouldn't want to have to be calling RCBS because over and over again, because I kept breaking little tiny pieces in it. I think that's one of the reasons that this was kind of a problem for them. Two is, you kind of have to look at the competitors, right? A good example is the 450. Here's a machine that was simpler to operate, does essentially the exact same thing. This one you have to manually index, right? This indexes on its own. Manually drop powder, manually activate the primer system, but still, your 4-station progressive reloader, fraction of the cost, much, much simpler. So if I'm a consumer and I'm looking at these two options here, I most likely load for more than one caliber, and that kind of limits my choice here. This is pretty cheap to get set up for a second, third, fourth, however many calibers you want. And I'm kind of, have my ear out there listening to reviews of things, and people are having trouble with this, and it's expensive. Whereas, nobody really has trouble with the 450s. I think I'm going to, choose against the Green Machine. And I've heard stories, I, again, don't really have any first-hand knowledge of this, but I've heard stories of people being so angry with their Green Machines that they demanded RCBS take them back and refunded them. And I've read a couple of instances where maybe that actually happened. And, as far as marketing and customer service goes, that was, probably a pretty decent decision on their choice if that actually happened. But I know the ones that still exist, when discussion comes up about them, there's two sides to it. One of them is, that thing's an absolute piece of junk, I wouldn't take another one if I had to. And the other side is usually, hey, I've got one that I've got up and running, I need parts for it, somebody want to give me theirs for parts. So those are the kind of the two sides. I think they're fascinating machines. I really like the action, the linear progressive action of them. Pretty neat machines. But again, this isn't my primary loading machine. If it was, I would probably have a different opinion of it. It's, to me, just a shelf piece, so pretty neat. So anyways, if anybody out there has Green Machines, experiences with them, I know there's folks on YouTube that show a lot of the modifications that they've done to their machines to get them up and running, and kudos to you guys for being inventive. I think that's pretty cool. But if you have any more facts or information about this, or want to show me yours, well, drop me a comment. I'd appreciate it. So thanks for watching. I do greatly appreciate it. I'm not terribly certain what the next reloading press video is that I'm going to do, but since we're on the subject of 4-station presses with a linear movement component to them, might be fitting to talk about the CH206. This one's pretty cool. It looks to be a kind of normal single stage press, but it has a die plate with 4 positions that you can move in a linear fashion. So kind of like a turret press, but in a linear movement. How neat is that? Even that one. Let me do that one again. Of the Green Machine. Since we were on the topic of 4-station progressive